I am Flavia Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Curtin University's Dr. Ben Rich. Today we are going to be discussing the current situation in the Persian Gulf, current economic perspectives, and security challenges in the region. Thank you for being with us, Ben.
Thank you.
Ben, if you could explain to us the current economic situation in the Persian Gulf and how is the current political landscape and security challenges in the region?
So I've obviously come at this from a Saudi perspective, and what we're seeing inside Saudi Arabia economically at the moment is sort of a massive overhaul, or attempt to massively overhaul the economy to move away from being purely reliant on oil and gas as the main resource that drives the economy, and instead move towards privatisation initiative, move away from the sort of extensive welfare capacity of the state, and essentially try to make the economy more investor-friendly, driving ingenuity and stuff like that. These are things that are not, unfortunately, traditionally organic to that economy. So I think there's quite a bit of challenges ahead in that regard. You know, there's been an initiative put forward known as the Vision 2030 by this kind of new generation of leadership that's currently rising up, that's embodied in Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's quite young. He's seen, particularly by the younger Saudis, as this kind of dynamic figure. But the problem is that he seems to not necessarily be aware of the historical trends in this regard. This is not the first time this has been undertaken by the Saudi state, and previous attempts have not been, in many cases, particularly successful. In terms of the security situation, what we've seen is that, particularly since 2011, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran has really kind of flared up. There's always been a sort of regional competition between the two, even under the Shah. People forget this. They think that 1979 was when this conflict started. Well, no, it was just less obvious prior to that. But what we've seen since 2011 is this growing sense, partially founded in the Saudi elite, that Iran has attempted to exploit the kind of chaos and anarchy that has been ushered in by the Arab Spring. In some cases, that paranoia has been correct. In others, it really hasn't. So if we look at, for instance, what's going on in the east of Saudi Arabia today, with this rather heavy-handed use of crackdowns and, let's be real, state terror against the country's Shia minority, this is justified in many ways in the minds of the elite, because they're trying to essentially push back against Iranian influence, and Iranian influence that, for all intents and purposes, we don't really think is there. But that fear is there, and that is driving it.
Thank you very much, Ben. And Ben, can you please explain to us to which extent the historical rivalry between Sunni and Shias in Saudi Arabia and Iran has had an influence in the relationship between Saudis and the United States?
What we talk about, like when we look at the sort of the rise of sectarianism, one of the major narratives in the current sort of assessment of what is going on in the Gulf at the moment is that, you know, when we talk about nation states, we're really talking about Sunni states versus Shia states. You know, Iran being the Shia state, Syria being a Shia state, although that's a very problematic thing, since the Syrian regime is secular and aggressively secular. And then a collection of Sunni states, and this is driving the conflict there because of this intrinsic sort of sectarian rivalry that's kind of hard-coded in here. The problem with this narrative is it doesn't really hold up to history. So a great example I like to use is, you know, people talk about Iraq today, and they say that Iraq is, you know, intrinsically unfeasible because it has this Sunni-Shia divide, and there's conflict between Sunni and Shia, and this stretches back to, just after the times of Muhammad. You got to look at the statistics. In the 1990s, 50% of marriages in Baghdad were between Sunni and Shia families. So someone forgot to tell them about this endless rivalry. What we see is actually these types of conflicts are often stoked by nation states. So sectarianism is a tool that is used particularly by the Saudis. The Iranians, because they are a Shia nation state, and because Shia have typically occupied a much less privileged role in the Middle East, have kind of tried to play as a kind of universalist. We represent, Islam, and we're not really talking about the divides between Sunni and Shia. The Saudis, on the other hand, in part because of a history that stretches back to 1744, when you had the rise of this, radical revivalist movement known as Wahhabism. This is a natural fallback for them. What it does is it basically says to their populations, to onlookers, look, we are the championing the Sunni movement, and these Shiites are over here. They're going to ruin the religion. They're going to ruin everything, and so you need to fall in line behind that. That was a very effective tactic in 2011 when the Saudis were essentially trying to respond to the Arab Spring, trying to prevent the emergence of a Sunni uprising. There was certainly Shia discontent in the East because the Shia have traditionally occupied a very marginal role there, but they were able to essentially create a sense that challenges to the regime emanated from that Shiite minority and through them Iran, and as a result of that, if you were challenging the regime as a Sunni, you were actually abdicating your role as a good Sunni Muslim. In terms of how that relates to the United States, I actually don't think it's a big factor in the calculus. I don't think that these factor in. They don't particularly decide that we're going to back the Sunnis or we're going to back the Shias. If you look back during the Cold War, the US was perfectly capable of having the twin pillars strategy, in which it supported both the Saudis and the Iranians simultaneously as what they were seen by the US as conservative powers that would push back against communism in the region.
Thank you very much, Ben. Now, just to finalize our interview, Ben, if you could please explain to us the situation in Yemen and to which extent the war in Yemen would be a proxy war of Saudis versus Iranians.
Yeah, so I think what has happened here is part of the reason the Saudis originally intervened into Yemen was a fear that the Iranians were there being nefarious and doing things right on their southern border, and there was obviously a fear that this threatened their existential interests. Yemen has traditionally been seen by the Saudis as a kind of problematic little brother in the region. It was naturally their territory. They didn't necessarily want to occupy it, but they wanted to make sure that they had a great degree of influence of any regime that was in power there. So when we saw sort of simmering tensions with the Zaydi Shia in the north build up over the 2010s and then really explode after 2011, there was a fear there that this, because they were Shia, despite being a different form of Shias, and they're called Fivers, whereas the Iranians are Twelvers. This has a lot of difference between interpretation of doctrine. There was a fear that the Iranians were, there and they were fomenting it, much like the Saudis had feared that the Iranians were in Bahrain and fomenting uprisings there, which subsequently was also proven to be a false assertion. Now, what's happened is, since then, we've seen an escalation of the Saudis. They've done some fairly unprecedented things with the invasion, alongside a number of their GCC partners, chief among them the UAE. And there is some evidence that the Iranians are supporting the Houthis there, but this is primarily through the use of arms, basically cheap tactics. You can basically bog your enemy down in this quagmire, because Yemen is essentially the Afghanistan of the Arabian Peninsula. It's very mountainous. It has a very substantial series of very resistant actors who do not wish to sort of be consolidated under a nation state. So if they just, pour some arms in there, give them a bit of training now and then, this basically makes them more resistant, and this has led to what we see today in part with the Saudi forces, with the GCC coalition bogged down, unable to make gains and looking for a way to sort of pull out without losing face, which is a very difficult prospect at this point. Does that mean the Houthis are fighting for the Iranians? No, I don't think so. I think it's just the Iranians look for ways to spoil. They look for spoilers, and by supporting the Houthis, this has certainly played into their handbook. This doesn't mean that you're going to get an Iranian proxy state suddenly cropping up on the Arabian Peninsula, however.
Fascinating, Ben. Thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you for being with us, and for more information, please look at our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.